Are you practicing jazz for hours without getting anywhere? So I wasted years trying to figure out what to practice until I discovered 5 exercises that completely transformed my progress. And it doesn't just work for me, I always give these to my students and see incredible results. So in this video I'm gonna show you the 5 exercises that I wish I'd learned sooner so that you can skip all the mistakes and learn faster. Plus, why legends like John Scofield always recommend learning from Joe Pass. Before we dive into the Joe Pass exercises, let's deal with a huge problem for most jazz beginners: getting scales, arpeggios, and chromatic notes to actually work together in a solo. You spend hours practicing each category, but when it's time to improvise, your playing just sounds random and disconnected. How do you turn all that practice into real music? Think of the notes on the fretboard like a pyramid. At the very top, the tip of the pyramid, are your chord tones. Those are the most important notes, the ones that give your solo melody and connection to the song. The next layer down is your scale notes, which add color and variation while supporting the chord tones. And at the base, you've got all the chromatic notes, the white foundation that you can use for extra flavor, but these do need to be resolved in the right way. Thinking of the notes in this way gives you a way to understand them in relation to the chord and the scale. Everything has a place and you know how to work with them when you play. So how do you actually practice this and add layers on the fretboard? Let's break it down with a simple chord, C major 7. If you're improvising, you have the chord tones as the important notes, so just the arpeggio. Scale notes are extra melodic material to use around the arpeggio. And then the chromatic notes are also in there, but they need to be resolved or used in the right way, often by leading to a chord tone. Don't practice scales, arpeggios, and chromatic phrases as separate exercises. You want to tie them together and link them from the beginning, and the best way to do that is to practice the arpeggios in the scale as diatonic arpeggios. And often the most effective way to do this is then as 1-octave arpeggios. The reason that these are more efficient is that for jazz you will mostly use them in licks like that. It's really just a part of the style. Now this goes for other exercises as well, like diatonic triads, but you also want to work on using chromatic notes by turning those phrases into exercises. This exercise is diatonic triads with chromatic enclosures, and the goal is to take the things that you want to use in your solos and turn them into exercises so they become second nature and you discover where they fit into the music. This approach will totally change how you see the fretboard and make improvising so much easier. But how do you get your solos to actually sound like jazz and not just a bunch of scales and arpeggios? Let's look at that. Did you ever wonder how the top jazz guitarists really learned to play? So John Scofield and Mike Stern both point to the Joe Pass guitar style book as an essential resource. Why? Now, because Joe Pass solos are more than just a bunch of cool licks. They are a masterclass in how to build real jazz vocabulary, if you use them the right way. When I first started learning jazz, my teacher gave me tons of licks to memorize. And don't get me wrong, learning licks is really important. It helps you get a feel for how melodies flow, how rhythms work, and how to phrase your lines. But there is a problem. Just memorizing licks is nowhere near enough. What I didn't learn back then was how to actually turn those licks into flexible vocabulary, something I could really use in my solos. It's like learning a language. You don't just repeat phrases from a textbook, you learn words and then you practice putting them together in a conversation. So how do you learn jazz words? Let's use an example from the Joe Pass book that Scofield recommends and explore that. As a side note, this is a great phrase that I just always messed up in the lesson when I had it as homework. In the book, it's over a B flat minor 7 in one of the Parker Blues examples. To make it easier, let's just first move it to a D minor 7 chord in C major, like this. An important thing to learn from the Joe Pass book is that the solos are constructed of smaller building blocks. This example has 2 blocks, 2 chord tones with an enclosure around the lowest. Here that's the F moving down to the D, and then there's an enclosure around the D, so. The other building block is a descending Coltrane pattern built on the 3rd of the chord. So for D minor, the 3rd is of course F, and the Coltrane pattern that you get is then this. Let's focus on the first part since it has all the things that are great about bebop phrases: chord tones, chromatic notes, and changing melodic direction. Now, to explore how to connect that to your other vocabulary, you can use this phrase as a part of a 2-5, so figure out how to get to a G7 and compose or construct lines. Something like this. Or maybe continue with an ascending F major 7 arpeggio. And this Grand Green inspired line is also great with the pedal point and the line cliché. That is how you should study licks and vocabulary. Don't just play them, try to make variations and use those while soloing. In fact, you should aim to practice everything on songs, because that's where it all comes together. Let's talk about that before moving on to some essential jazz chords. One of the biggest misunderstandings about learning jazz is reducing it to a bunch of skills and exercises. I see this all the time. Students feel stuck, and when I ask what they're practicing, it's just technical exercises, scales, inversions, or endless 2-5-1s in all keys. But here's the problem. You'll never sound like you're playing music if you only practice exercises. Peter Bernstein is often quoted for saying, "Learn the song and let the song teach you." And there is a reason why every great jazz player spends time with real songs, not just patterns and technical exercises. And that is why you always need to use what you practice on real songs. It's not just about exercises, it's about melody, form, and harmony. Here's what you're missing if you skip that step. Melody. A looping 2-5-1 or a 2-5-1 in all keys doesn't have a melody. If the goal is to solo over songs, you need to learn to hear the harmony and the form from the melody. But if the things you practice don't have a melody, you won't learn that. Instead, you're forced to think and count all the time, which is actually much more difficult and not how you want to approach music in the first place. Form. Another important skill that you want to develop is playing solos on the songs that tell a story. And that's about dealing with the form of the song. But if you're only playing on a loop 2-5-1, you don't train that at all. There is no form. And finally, harmony. There's way more to jazz harmony than just 2-5s and turnarounds. If you only practice those, you're missing out on a lot of great music and a lot of great harmony. So what should you do instead? Now, practicing 2-5-1s can be a good exercise, but you need to get your practice as close as possible to what you want to do when you're actually playing. And that means playing songs. And this isn't just about soloing. It goes for chords and comping as well. So let's explore how to approach jazz chords next. When I started out, I thought jazz comping meant memorizing hundreds of big, complicated chord shapes, and I spent hours practicing, but as soon as I tried to use them in a song, everything fell apart. Now, the truth about this is that jazz isn't about knowing a million chords, it's about making a handful of chords flexible and then comp like that. That's where shell voicings come in. Think of them as the bread of a sandwich. It can become 1,000 different things, but that's the foundation. Shell voicings are just 3 notes that give you the core sound of any chord, and you can add notes to get extensions, alterations, make it a chord melody or chords and walking bass. Almost everything is possible. So how do you actually use these in your playing? Now, you only need 2 sets, root on the 5th string and root on the 6th string. And shell voicings fit together so that you can move smoothly through chord progressions. For example, here's a 2-5-1 in C major using both sets, and check out how the chords just flow into each other. Instead of just memorizing shapes, focus on these 3 things. Play songs. Use the voicings in actual music, not just exercise. Focus on rhythm. Great comping is about time and groove, not just fancy chords. Split the chord. Try separating the bass note and the chord tones. This gives you more options and makes your comping sound more interesting without learning any new chords. Once you're comfortable with shell voicings, take them through the scale just like you would with arpeggios. This foundation makes it way easier to later explore rootless voicings, extensions and substitutions. But remember, the key is to play clear harmony with solid rhythm, because that's what really matters in jazz. Now, let's explore an equally important skill for soloing. If I could go back and change one thing about how I learned jazz, it would probably be this. My teachers didn't really encourage this in my first years of studying, and I really think that's a pity, because it's probably the fastest, most fun, and most rewarding way to learn jazz. I'm of course talking about learning solos by ear. And yes, it can feel challenging at first, but the payoff is huge. Think of it like being a student of a master craftsman. You don't just read the manual, you watch the master copy their moves, and eventually those skills become a part of what you do. Learning jazz solos by ear is the same. You're picking up the craft directly from the source. And here's why this works so well. When you learn a solo by ear, you're not just memorizing notes, you are absorbing the phrasing, the technique, timing and vocabulary of a real jazz musician all at once. Phrasing. You pick up how to articulate and shape lines naturally, something that's very difficult to explain or do just analyzing material. Technique. Your fingers learn the real moves of jazz, you're playing the right things. Timing. You internalize the feel and rhythmic placement of a great soloist. And finally, vocabulary. You get the authentic jazz language, not just scales and theory. And this is where you pick up the stuff that you turn into exercises. And the best part, now because you've figured out the notes yourself, you don't need to spend a lot of time practicing to play the solo. It's already in your ears and under your fingers. So how do you actually get started with this and make it easier? Now pick the right solo. Don't start with something too fast or complicated. Choose a solo that's short, at a moderate tempo and on a simple song. Maybe a standard you know or a blues. Pro tip: before you even touch your instrument, listen to the solo 50 to 100 times. Loop it while you're driving, cooking or relaxing. This makes figuring it out 1,000 times easier and helps you remember everything you learn. And you don't want to write this down because you want to have it in your system, in your ears, not reading it from a page. Now this approach is a game changer. You will develop your ear, technique and jazz feel faster than with any scale or arpeggio exercise. And it's way more fun. So you've just learned the fastest way to pick up jazz solos, but what about chords? Now Joe Pass was legendary for turning simple voicings into magical chord solos. The secret? He used a flexible chord system that most players never even hear about. And that's exactly what I break down in this next video, using one of his actual chord solos. And the best part, it's mind-blowingly simple, way easier than you'd expect. Check it out. Learn jazz, make music.